James is offering us advice, and we've been following through his teaching to the church that he's dealing with to understand what it means to live out our faith, to follow through with the things we say we believe, the things we do believe, with action, and that we would learn how to live it out in our everyday lives. And so it applies to all kinds of different ways that we've seen, and today is no different. And so as we begin our passage, James' opening advice to us today is, don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you're criticizing and judging God's law. In this translation, don't speak evil of each other is a word, and I got to look at the word to pronounce it right, katalaleo. And that word means, also can be translated slander. Some translations will take it as slander. And so he says, don't speak evil against each other, don't slander each other. And katalaleo, it means to say bad things, but so sometimes it's kind of saying generally bad stuff about people, speaking poorly about them, but there's not the sense that, or sometimes there's this sense that those bad things could be false, right? And so slander sometimes means that you're saying something that's evil against them and it's not true. But other times, katalaleo has the sense of the general, don't speak evil of other people. And so it says it can be bad things that you're sure are true. So it's not always, but if it's true, then even if it's true, you can cross the line by speaking the way James is suggesting not to speak. And if you look back through Scripture, what you'll find is that there's this long history of these kind of warnings. In Leviticus 19:16, for example, it says, do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. And in Psalm 101, verse 5, I will not tolerate people who slander their neighbors. I will not endure conceit and pride. And then there's Proverbs 10:18. Hiding hatred makes you a liar. Slandering others makes you a fool. So you'd almost get the sense that you can flip through Scripture, and every so often you're going to find the same warning about slander, and that God's warning us over and over again. It must be an ongoing problem for people of God. And so it's like humans need that constant reminder that we shouldn't slander other people. We shouldn't talk smack about them, even if you think what you're saying is true. And then when it comes to the next part where he talks about judging, there's lots of scriptures about judging too. Matthew 7:1, Jesus is quoted as saying, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. In Romans, Paul writes, when you say they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. Then to the church in Corinth, he writes, so don't make judgments about anyone ahead of time before the Lord returns, for he will bring our darkest secrets to light and will reveal our private motives. Then God will give to each one whatever praise is due. So you get the where he's going here. Paul is saying that, we should be careful about that because sometimes we're doing the same thing. And so he warns us about that we can have the same problem, and we don't see it in ourselves, but we see it in others. And then, of course, the next one there in Corinth, he says, don't make judgments about anyone ahead of time before the Lord returns, for he will bring our darkest secrets to light and reveal our private motives. That's true of the good motives and the bad motives. God sees through everything that we're doing. And so that's why in Psalm 9:20 it says, arise, O Lord, do not let mere mortals defy you. Judge the nations. So the psalmist is saying, God, you should judge the nations. And then in Genesis, following on from there, surely you wouldn't do such a thing. destroying the righteous along with the wicked. Why, you would be treating the righteous and the wicked exactly the same. Surely you wouldn't do that. God is a fair judge. God sees everything. And so he knows what's going on in our speech, in our behavior. He knows what's going on in our hearts. And so we're told that he sees the full picture. And then in Genesis 18 and 25, it says, should not the judge of all the earth do what's right? So again and again, we're told not to judge. Again and again, we're told that we need to be careful that judgment and slander happens. And so again and again, we're warned about the same thing. And you can see in those last two verses, it warns us that and gives us the reason why we're warned not to judge, because there's already a judge, and it's God. And so that brings us back to James' statement when we began. Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you are criticizing and judging God's law. So he's saying, don't slander, don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you're criticizing and judging God's law. So to speak, he talks about speaking evil, and he talks about judging, but he's not just making a list of things, right? Because if you stop and think about those two things, you realize that there's a direct correlation. That when he tells us not to slander, we're supposed to be careful about our speech and what we're saying about other people. And then when he tells us that criticizing and judging each other is criticizing and judging God's law, he's telling us that we shouldn't judge, and he's really illustrating for us that what happens and the order of events. What happens is we judge somebody, we decide we see the full picture, we decide that we think that we're in that position where we see clearly what's going on here, and we judge them in our hearts, and then that judging can blur out into slandering. We can go around and say, well, you know, this is what I think, and this is what I saw happen, and this is how I look at it, and we can start to speak out of the place where we've already judged somebody in our hearts. And so he's saying don't slander and don't judge, because one leads naturally into the other. But specifically, if you notice there, the statement that he makes, he says, if you criticize and judge each other, then you're criticizing and judging God's law. So what does he mean by that? How is judging my brother, my sister, how is choosing a person and saying, here's what I think of them, and here's what's going on with them, and how is judging them judging God's law? They're both things that you say, well, we probably shouldn't do that, but how are they the same? James says, if you criticize and judge, that's judging God's law. And for that, I would take us back to the first passage we looked at in James together. In chapter 2, verse 8 of James, we read, yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself. So what James is saying, and if we think about the totality of the things we've been discovering together in James, that all of these things are illustrations of that royal law and violations of it. That if we, as he said in chapter 1, you know, if we ignore widows and orphans and we don't care for those who don't have a way to provide for themselves, and maybe this is a good sermon for Thanksgiving in that sense, if we just count up our blessings and say thank you to God, but we never bless those who are in need around us and never use our resources for that, but we just say, thanks for all the great stuff you give me, God. I'm just going to enjoy it. And if it stops there, James warns us that that's not really living out that royal law to love our neighbor as ourselves. If we care about our neighbor, then it's not okay with us if they go hungry. It's not okay if they go without because we are not generous. And likewise, when he starts to talk about favoritism in the church and says, you know, in his particular church, he says, some people walk in and they're rich and you treat them like they're golden, come sit over here in this place of honor, and then somebody else walks in the door and they don't look like they've got, you can tell looking at them, the way they're dressed, they don't have much money, go sit in the corner over there. And they don't matter as much. But he's not just talking about money. He's not talking about just honoring people who are rich and dishonoring people who are poor. He's saying whatever criteria you've got for your exterior judgment, where you're valuing some people over others, because that's not consistent with the law to love your neighbor. And so everything else that we've been looking at, all of these lessons, have been consistent with that theme. And so James is not just giving, one teaching and then another teaching. He's building on what he said before. And so when he says in chapter 2, this is the royal law, love your neighbor as yourself, now he's referring back to that law and he's saying, that's the royal law. Like, that's at the heart of this. If we don't love our neighbors, we're missing something. That's when Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. What's the greatest commandment? It's that, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus ties loving God with loving our neighbor. He won't just give one best one and say, well, second place is this. He says, if you want the one law, and in that way, Jesus is covering everything else. Because if you look at all the laws, if you look at the top 10 laws, the 10 commandments, or if you want to look at the 613 statutes in the Old Testament law, all the different laws, you'll find that they all boil down to those two. Like they're all kind of unpacking the specifics and the minutia of loving God and loving our neighbor. Nothing doesn't fall into that category. And so James, as he's trying to get to the heart of what it means to love God, not just to believe in him, but to follow him, he says, you got to love your neighbor. And here he says, look, if you are judging and criticizing your neighbor, if you're looking at them in that way, and then sometimes speaking about them in that way, he says that violates the royal law because you're not really loving your neighbor. And so James wants us to know that that's a problem. See, when he says your job is to obey the law, and he's talking about the royal law, he says not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save and destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbor? So it boils down to that truth. And so why he says not to judge is because there's already a judge, and it's God. So if you'd like, you can repeat this after me. God is the judge. Feel that's true? You can say it. God's the judge. And this part, say it with me. I am not God. So if that's true, that God is the judge and I'm not God, I don't have the right to go around and judge people's motives and assume I know what's motivating them, and especially not to talk about them in that way. And so James explains why you shouldn't do that. He says, how do you know? So the next thing that he goes to, in addition to this admonition not to judge or slander, James says, look here, you who say, today or tomorrow, we're going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. He says, some people in the church, they're making plans, they own a business, and they say, I'm going to go to this place, I'll stay there a year, I'll build on my business, I'll make a profit, here's my plan to make this work. We got some business owners in our congregation, and that's kind of the deal, right? You're trying to run your business to make a profit. You want to make money. Nobody gets into business and goes, I hope I can lose about $10,000 this year, right? It's not the goal. And so they're making a plan. And so people are making a plan for business, and they're merchants in his world. Merchants they weren't super rich, but they would have more than the average person, right? They would be at the upper end of kind of that group of people, the main group of people, the middle class. And so merchants, they would do that kind of business. And their world, there was not Amazon. So most people made the things they needed. They grew crops. They prepared things. They maybe even made their own tools. Like all those things were things that they could do for themselves. And whatever they could do for themselves, they did. But there were certain items, certain objects they needed that you couldn't make for yourself. And so the merchants would provide a service. It wasn't like casual shopping. It was, this is an implement, this is a tool that would make our lives easier. This is something that would help us do something we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so the merchants gained a certain amount of money just by saying, we can meet that need. You can meet the most of them, but we've got this thing, and you really need it, and we got it. You can make a profit doing business that way. So most of them, they weren't at the top of the food chain, but they were more well-to-do than the average person. And they wanted to be successful, to make a profit, and they would plan on making money, and there's nothing inherently wrong about that. Why would that be a problem? And why would talking about it be an issue? Why if you can make a plan, why can't you tell people, I got a plan? Like, you don't want to go into business and go, well, I'm just going to wing it. See what happens. See what happens indeed, right? Especially if it's a restaurant or something like that. So many of them go under all the time. It's hard to make go in a business. And so having a plan seems like it's a good idea. That seems like wisdom. And to try to make a profit, there's nothing shameworthy there. But James explains what he's talking about. He explains why you shouldn't say that. And he says, how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, and then it's gone. And then he offers another alternative how to speak about your plans. He says, what you ought to say is, the Lord wants us to. If the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you're boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. How do you know what your life will be tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here for a little while and it's gone. He goes, you don't know what the future's going to bring. You can plan, and some of us, me included, I like to have a very detailed plan. Like, I like to figure stuff out. I like to think like a tree in branches, and think, well, if this happens then, and if this happens then, and if this happens then, I like to have a really detailed plan. And James reminds us, you can't consider all possibilities. You can try to be wise, and you can try to think through what might happen, but you aren't in control of all the circumstances. And then he says, what you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, he says, you're boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. So what do you have to do here? Like, there are people who kind of speak spiritually, and they bring that in, and you go, well, okay. But really, is this about just saying, okay, I'm going to say the exact same thing, and I'm going to exercise, plans, and I'm going to talk to people about plans, but I just got to say, if the Lord willing, every time. Like, if the Lord willing, I'm going to go down to the corner store and get a carton of milk. If the Lord's willing, I'm going to go to work this morning. If the Lord's willing, when I come home, this will happen, and I'll take care of these chores. It's not about super spiritualizing our speech, but if you understand correctly what James is talking about here, then you understand how these two passages fit together. James is saying there's a way to live and make plans for the future that ignores that you are not in control of things. You're just, your life is fog, right? He says your life, you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while and then it's gone. You know what fog's like? Have you ever come in and driven to the church in the fog? I come around that bend in the road sometimes, and as before I even get on Cedar Haven Road, I'm like, where's the church? And I pull across the front lawn, and before I get to the laneway, it's like, where's the church? And I get halfway down the lane, and I say, I see, yeah, that's the church. Fog can make all kinds of things unclear. And if we're honest, sometimes as much as we try to be in control of our circumstances, as much as we try to anticipate everything and evaluate life and keep things under our control, there are things we can't see clearly. And then sometimes there are things we see faintly, and sometimes we get some vision. So James is saying, look, if you understand that life has all kinds of mystery to it, and we don't understand it fully, and if you understand that God is part of your planning process, if you as a believer go, I'm going to take God into consideration in what I'm planning. Even in my business, I'm going to say, there's a way to go about these things. There's a way to make plans. There's a way to set goals that honors God and listens to his voice and hears what he wants from me. And if your goal is to do that, to please God with your life, then your plans may change, and they may not look, nobody else could spot it from the outside and say, well, that's not a very godly plan. It may not be about it not being godly. The point for James is that as you're making your plans and the way that you speak about your plans, if God is completely absent in your plan, says that not going to do you very well. And says that these people, these merchants in his world that are boasting about their plans, they're kind of telling everybody their great plans so everybody be impressed by the fact that they travel for work and they go there and they're going to make a profit. He says, as long as it's all about you and your plans, as long as it's just about what you're accomplishing, as long as it's just about your gathering and not listening for the voice of God, says that is not right. He says all that kind of boasting is evil. So then he closes off by saying, remember, it's a sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. What he's been driving at this whole time, what the whole letter is pointing us to, is knowing something in our heads, believing something with all our hearts, but not living in the reality of it. And so then you see how his teaching here, when he teaches us about slander, speaking evil of people, and judging, and then he starts talking about business owners and how they plan, then the theme comes together and you understand what he's saying. That when we judge and we slander, we are taking the place of God. God is the judge. God is the one who's hearts. People are God's, and it's not up to us to fix them and make judgments on them. And we are also to include God in our planning, to do either judging and slandering and taking the place of God there, or ignoring God's very existence as we make our plans. Both things are to really live with what I would call functional atheism. We can say we believe in God. We can actually believe in God, but we're living as if he's not there. And that is what James is warning us about. And so when he says, remember it's a sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it, he's saying to the false teachers in his church, he's saying to the people who are getting off track, he's saying to the people who ignore the widows and orphans and their responsibility to look after those who are dispossessed. He's saying to those who judge the rich over the poor and use external judgments for who is good and worthy and who is worthless. He's saying when it comes to this matter of judging and slandering, or the matter of making our plans, that if we do those things, and we already know that they're wrong, then we are not lining up with our beliefs, with the faith that we have, and the Lord that we profess. And so James is drilling down here again to what it means to be an authentic believer. And he calls us to live according to that royal law. See, in Scripture, it tells us, chapter 2, verse 8, James began this whole thing with saying, love your neighbor, this royal law. And so if the royal law is the law of the royal personage, the King Jesus, then we are bound to obey his law. And then we stop walking around in our world saying, the question is who we hate and who we love. It's not about who you hate. It's not even about who you love. It's about whether you hate, whether you love. Because for Jesus, love is at the center of it. So what you find is if you read the Ten Commandments, if you read the 613 statutes of the Old Testament law, nothing doesn't fall into that category of love your neighbor or love God. Every one of the other laws, if you talk about any of the Ten Commandments, you'll find, hey, that's an expression, that's a micro point of the larger point of loving God and loving your neighbor. And that's why when Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? He goes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's where James is getting this. That's why who he's quoting. He's quoting King Jesus. He says, and King Jesus says, we love our neighbor as ourselves. We treat people equally with ourselves. And so we don't walk around judging them. We don't do these things, and we don't ignore them, and we don't treat some people better than other people because they're rich or on those exterior kind of qualifications. But we follow Jesus. Jesus says love. Always love. He says love our neighbor, and he says love our enemy. Sometimes that's the same person. But for Jesus, that's at the center of the gospel, and that's why James takes this and says, here's how this applies to what's happening at that church. My prayer this morning is that we would see it. We would say, I want to follow that royal law. I want to apply that in every situation. I want to live the truth that James is trying to teach us as he once again tells us what the real deal looks like, what it means to love God, how we live out that love, loving the neighbors around us.